All right, so alleged sex offender and general sleazy Florida man Matt Gaetz recently came out against a piece of legislation that successfully passed the House of Representatives, no thanks to him, that essentially is intending to cap the cost of insulin for some diabetic Americans at $35 a month. And as you can see here from USA Today, the reasons for his no vote are pretty much some of the dumbest and most vile ones that I've heard in a minute. So let's go ahead and get into some of this. So from USA Today, they say Gaetz justifies his no vote on insulin cap bill by saying that diabetics should just simply lose weight. Okay, so let's get into some of the details. He said, so Representative Matt Gaetz justified his vote against a bill that would cap insulin at $35 a month for most Americans, and I'll get into the details of where this bill comes up short, but he was suggesting that people with diabetes should first lose weight before Congress steps in to help. And so the Florida Republican claimed on Twitter on Thursday and in his newsletter a day later that obese people, not pharmaceutical companies, are running up the drug's price, writing that insulin's cost increase as waistlines increase. So this is just straight up wrong at face value. I mean, it's not people with diabetes that get to determine the cost of insulin, and it's not these, free market principled market forces that drove up the cost of insulin. The reason why insulin costs as much as it does in the United States is because we allow for-profit, privatized big pharmaceutical companies to make billions and billions of dollars off of drugs like this, and they get to set the price because they essentially have a monopoly over the production and distribution of this drug, so they can just set whatever arbitrary price they want, and people who need this medicine as a life-saving drug are just going to have to front the cost, or in many cases, as you're about to see in some of the data here, they just straight up have to ration their insulin and don't get access to it, and they might die, or they might, risk dying because of that. So the reasons why insulin costs as much as it does in the United States is definitely 100% because of the pharmaceutical companies, not because of people who have diabetes. But he continues saying, while Democrat posturing of H.R. 6833 victimizes insulin payees. I mean, literally, imagine being this much of a demon to come out and say that this bill is victimizing insulin payees. Yeah, I think people who are having to pay hundreds, if not thousands of dollars a month for a life-saving drug that they need to survive, maybe they are, justified in being called victims in this situation. But he says, Democrat posturing of H.R. 6833 victimizes insulin payees as people with an uncontrollable disease that are being taken advantage of, and need Big Brother to throw them a raft. Lifestyle changes in mass would expeditiously lower demand and the subsequent prices of insulin. So no, it wouldn't. I mean, literally no, it wouldn't. Even if you accept his bullshit argument here that if everybody just magically, worked out more and had a healthier lifestyle, not even going to get into the discussions about how people who are disproportionately more likely to have diseases like diabetes, especially type 2, are more likely to be economically deprived and wouldn't even have access to a lot of the other healthy food options and other access to having the ability to fit these types of things into their schedule. So not even getting into any of that, but even just taking his argument at face value that if people had healthier lifestyles, you could therefore lower the amount of people who have type 2 diabetes. Okay, even if you accept that, how does that mean that the prices of insulin are going to go down? Because again, the people who are producing, the corporations that are producing insulin, have monopoly control over this industry, and so they're setting the prices based on how they can maximize returns to their shareholders, to their executives, their CEOs. It has nothing to do with the amount of diabetic patients you have. It's just completely absurd to frame it in that way. And on top of that, it's also just not even true that it's purely a matter of lifestyle changes to lower the amount of people who have type 2 diabetes. There are many other factors that go into determining whether you're going to get type 1 or type 2 diabetes that they mentioned down in this article, and we'll get into that. But they continue saying though the bill to limit the cost of insulin was Democrat sponsored, it passed the House on Thursday with bipartisan support, very limited bipartisan support. So 12 Republicans, just 12 of them, broke party ranks and voted with Democrats, and Gaetz was one of 193 House Republicans to vote against the bill. 193 House Republicans voted against a bill that would literally just cap the copay cost of insulin for people who have insurance in the United States to $35 a month. And listen, this doesn't even really touch the profit margins of these gigantic insulin manufacturers, because they're still going to get the money. They're just capping the copay cost from the user end or from the customer end, because this is how we stratify our healthcare system here in the United States, is on a for-profit modeling base. So it isn't even necessarily going to hurt the profit margins of these gigantic pharmaceutical companies, which I think is a problem with the bill. But even with that, 193 House Republicans still voted against this piece of legislation. It's literally like they just want people to suffer. But they continue with a little bit more details, saying, that about 1 in 10 Americans suffer from diabetes, substantial portion of the population, and more than 1 in 3 have prediabetes, according to the CDC. And type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease where the body is unable to create insulin, requiring it to be taken to survive. So if type 1 diabetes is predominantly determined by genetic factors or otherwise that have basically nothing to do with your healthy lifestyle or whatever the fuck, if a substantial amount of people who need insulin are type 1 diabetics, then Matt Gaetz's entire argument falls apart, because these are people who don't have the ability to go out and just simply exercise or eat healthier in order to lower the chance of them getting diabetes in the first place, because it's a genetic thing. But they continue with type 2 diabetes. The body doesn't use insulin well, and it's caused by several factors, and they're going to get into some of that. But they say insulin costs have sharply increased over the last decade, with some insulin users spending upward of $2,000 a month on the drug. $2,000 a month. And about 1 in 4 Americans report rationing insulin to save money. Okay, in the richest country in the history of the planet, 1 in 4 insulin users is having to ration their insulin and therefore literally risk their lives in order to subsidize the profit margins of these gigantic big pharma companies. Okay, and this is the dynamic that Matt Gaetz thinks is going really, really well. Okay, so let's continue with a little bit more details. They say, among Americans who take insulin, about 1 in 5 would save money under the proposal. And they say, while type 2 diabetes is tied to obesity and physical activity, it's also tied to a number of other causes like insulin resistance, genetics, family history, genetic mutations, hormonal diseases, certain medicines, and damage to the pancreas, according to the National Institutes of Health. And that type 1 is likely caused by genetics and environmental factors like viruses that may trigger the disease. So, okay, listen, you see the dynamic here, that there are plenty of different factors that go into both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, everybody just eat healthier and work out a little bit more and diabetes will cease to exist. And again, even if you accepted him at his argument, or accepted his argument at face value, that having people exercise more, having people eat healthier would lower the amount of people with diabetes, sure, that may be the case to some extent, but that would have nothing to do with the price of insulin, which again is entirely determined by these gigantic pharmaceutical companies. So I really could not think of a more demonic apparition like Matt Gaetz and coming out with an argument like this, because what he's effectively doing is just lobbying on behalf of big pharma in order to punish people who have punish people who need insulin as a life-saving medication. So it's just completely ridiculous and horrible and shitty for obvious reasons. But just a little bit more on the nuances of this bill, because I do think there are a lot of things to criticize about this. It doesn't go nearly far enough, and it's pointed out here by Laura Marston. She says, a reminder that the Democrats' bill does not lower insulin's price from $300 plus a vial and does not apply to the most vulnerable people, the uninsured. It is a co-payment cap for those privileged enough to have insurance, and it's a guarantee for pharma's insulin profits on the backs of taxpayers. So she's exactly right, and this is something that you could have a valid critique of, especially as Nancy Pelosi is coming out here and pretending as if the price of insulin in and of itself has been capped at $35 a month. No, it's not the price of insulin from the perspective of the pharmaceutical companies. It's the price of insulin from the very last step of what the actual insulin user has to pay when they go and they make their co-payments every single month in order to get this get their medication. So it's not actually addressing the underlying problem of having a for-profit pharmaceutical development industry in the first place. This is a perfect example of why we should nationalize our pharmaceutical industry and nationalize our health insurance industry, and really the entirety of our healthcare industry in general, is because just like insulin, just like the need for insulin is essentially an inelastic demand, so is the same with any other healthcare that you want to talk about. So in the most generic way, if you take what Matt Gaetz is arguing here, he's essentially arguing that, nobody who ever has even a marginal impact on their health, no disease that a person has even a marginal impact of control over, should be treated, should be, given, they shouldn't be given access to life-saving treatment because they had some degree of control over it. Well, if that's the case, then again, you would deny, access to life-saving medication to somebody who has lung cancer because they just so happen to be a smoker during their life. Or you could apply this to so many different things that it just gets extrapolated and falls apart when you start to think about how absolutely shitty of an idea that would be, both for patients and also just for society as a whole. Okay, this is exactly why we shouldn't have a healthcare system that is determined by how fat your wallet is and is determined by however much these gigantic pharmaceutical companies or health insurance companies want to return to their shareholders. So he's not only wrong, but he's also just pushing this propaganda in the most vile way imaginable. And on top of this, you also have the political angle of Republicans literally coming out here and arguing in favor of big pharma. Republicans coming out here and arguing in favor of higher prescription drug costs, in this case with insulin. So this could be the easiest political dub in the history of political dubs for Democrats if they successfully manage to pass this through the Senate. I'm honestly not sure if that realistically is going to happen. It seems like they're going to need at least 10 Republicans to get on board for that to happen, and we've seen this in the past. I would not be surprised if it doesn't manage to go forward, but hopefully it does, because even though this bill is massively, massively doesn't go far enough in terms of helping the uninsured, the most vulnerable people who don't have access to that insurance, even though it doesn't go far enough, it could still help millions of people. So I do hope that it gets passed, and I'll keep you guys updated on whether or not it does.